Casey is successful, smart, and dependable. On paper, they are the ideal partner. Yet their dates almost always end the same way, with a polite text the next day explaining that there was no connection. Before meeting Alex, Casey followed a familiar routine. They mentally cataloged their recent promotion, the logistics of a solo trip, and progress in a new language. These weren't just stories, they were a list of evidence to be presented. This preparation was driven by a persistent, quiet anxiety, a fear that Casey's inherent self was not enough to win someone over. Casey arrived at the date treating the encounter as a high-stakes assessment of their personal value. This mindset creates an internal performance requirement, a belief that worth is something to be earned through a tireless display of achievements. When someone feels their basic presence is insufficient, they transform a moment for human connection into an exhausting audition where they must relentlessly prove their value. The date began at a quiet coffee shop. Alex opened the conversation with a simple, friendly question. "So, what have you been up to lately?" For Casey, this was the signal to perform. They launched into a long explanation of their recent promotion, detailing the company changes and the hard problems they were now responsible for solving. Casey was caught in a psychological framework called the goal completion loop. In this loop, anxiety drives a person to keep talking, adding data and explanations until they receive a specific, unambiguous sign of approval. Alex listened, nodded, and offered polite acknowledgments, saying things like, "Wow, that's amazing." These polite responses failed to satisfy Casey's internal loop. Casey was unconsciously waiting for a definitive declaration of impressed approval. Without that specific signal, the anxiety dictated that any silence was a failure, requiring even more proof of worth. This need to perform forced Casey to repeatedly interrupt Alex. When Alex tried to share a small piece of their own life, Casey used it as a platform to talk even more about themselves. Casey's stories and achievements physically occupied the conversation. As Casey continued to list facts and training times, they left Alex no room to exist. Alex began to withdraw. They leaned back in their chair, stopped nodding, and eventually offered only short prompts to keep Casey talking. Casey was so focused on winning Alex over that they became blind to these cues. They missed the change in body language and the look of quiet acceptance in Alex's eyes. True sharing involves vulnerability and an expectation of reciprocity. Performance, by contrast, is entirely focused on the delivery and impact of the presentation. By treating their own value as a commodity to be sold, Casey inadvertently destroyed the shared space required for a relationship to breathe. Casey left the date feeling successful by their own internal standards. They had showcased their best qualities, yet they were still followed by a familiar, hollow emptiness. When Alex's text arrived saying there was no connection, Casey was confused. They had been interesting and impressive. How could the date have failed? Alex's rejection had nothing to do with Casey's career, hobbies, or life stories. Alex walked away from the role of the quiet watcher, a role Casey had unintentionally forced them into for over an hour. Connection is a space co-created through give and take, mutual curiosity, and a wish to know the other person as deeply as you want to be known. An acquisitive mindset focused on securing validation repels the very connection it seeks. Others are left feeling unseen and unheard, regardless of how impressive the speaker's story might be. You cannot try out for a connection. Inherent worth is a foundational truth. When the need to impress is laid aside, a real conversation begins.